Today we're going to be talking about puppetizing your organization. So setting up a proof of concept with Puppet is pretty easy. It's the easy part. But what's next? There's a lot of things, and it can sometimes be a little intimidating and scary. So let's take a look at the Puppet ecosystem. Hopefully you've got a master or masterless workflow already. And we're going to need to add some things that kind of wrap around culture. Code reviews, testing, take a look at some best practices and patterns for your code. And we're also going to take a look at tooling. And this can be everything from bare metal all the way up to packaging. And of course, when we take everything that we learned today and we put it all together, hopefully we're going to come up with something that's just simply amazing and beautiful. And yeah, there you go. So hopefully it leaves a big smile on everybody's face like it does here. So first we want to talk about culture. And when we're talking about culture, we're talking about setting up the way people do things. Some of it's going to involve tooling, but we're going to get that foundation. If we have a great cultural foundation, it doesn't matter what tool we pick, we'll be able to work with it. If we don't have a great culture, it really doesn't matter what tool we pick because it won't matter at all. So with culture, if we're leading the charge here, I'm assuming most people here are either the person that set up Puppet or driving the project, we need to be a change agent. And what that means is we need to be the person, not necessarily who does all the change, because culture change is a collaborative effort, but we're the ones that are the driving force behind it. We need to understand that Rome wasn't built in a day. Culture change takes a lot of time. It might even take 2 to 3 years, but we should see some immediate results. There's going to be a lot of learning along the way, and with learning comes failure. For some people, this may be the norm. You know, if you're in a research and development organization, I'm sure that that's the norm, but for others, we may not have that culture. So as the change agent, make sure that you work with management, work with people above you to ensure that if somebody spends a week on something and it doesn't work out, that they're not penalized for it. If they, this is all new, so if you happen to do something that breaks in production, we don't want people to worry about losing their jobs or even just getting reprimanded. Communication is absolutely key. It's going to be new to us, so hopefully we're going to learn, and then we're going to help the other people for which Puppet is new. Maybe set up some training sessions, write some documentation. But it's also about listening. It's great even for me to get up here and talk to you all about the things I've learned, but it's also important to hear from you, to hear from the people on your team. And it's also very important to make sure that people feel heard. Somebody might come to you, and they might have a better idea, and you take it. Somebody else might come to you, and their idea maybe doesn't work this time. But make sure that they understand that you actually took the time to hear what they had to say and evaluated it so that they feel that you're listening to them. Because we need to make sure everybody's involved. And as we go through this culture change, we need to kind of pace ourselves. Luke talked about this in the keynote today. You can't force change upon people. It needs to be collaborative. If we push too hard, we get culture shock. People push back on us. They dig their heels in. We try and implement things that are good, and they reject it. Sometimes we only get one shot at this. If you push way too hard, you don't get another shot. So make sure you take your time here. It's better for this culture change to take a longer amount of time than to not happen at all. And as we're talking about communicating and learning and everything else, I want to touch on the subject of expert beginners. I read a great blog post by Eric Dietrich. The quote there says it all. I know that I'm doing it right because as an expert, pretty much doing everything right by definition. I'm sure we've all had this happen to us, and sometimes we've been that person. And the key here is if you look on the right, that chart, there's a progression from novice to expert. And every step of the way, you learn a little more, you get some feedback, you figure out what you don't know, and you keep going. Unless you kind of take that left turn at Albuquerque and head over to be an expert beginner. When you head that direction, you're not recognizing what you don't know. And as you see, there's no progression to the next level. And some ways to avoid having this happen to you and to the others that you're working with as you grow this Puppet within your organization is to avoid some of that rock star mentality. It's awesome when somebody fixes that problem at 3 in the morning and they save everybody else from whatever headache it may have caused. But we want to make sure that whatever lessons they learn, they collaborate with other people. We don't just say yeah, that person's awesome, and every time we have a problem, we give it to them. We want to share, we want to have some feedback loops for that person and for the other people in the organization. So we don't want that person working in isolation. There's a lot of great ways to get feedback loops. Puppet user groups, PuppetConf, we're all here, hopefully to learn from other people, and plenty of other things up there. And one thing I'll caution you when you participate in anything to get these feedback loops, especially things that are external to your company, make sure that you get buy-in from your family. Coming to PuppetConf takes you away from your family, so make sure everybody's cool with that. And talk to your employer. Make sure you're not sharing data that would be sensitive. And just make sure that they understand you're going out and doing this. Even though you may not be giving anything away, especially if your manager hears from you that you're going out there instead of somebody else, because then signals can get mixed and maybe get in trouble. So make sure you don't get in trouble with any of this. But certainly find those feedback loops for yourself and for people on your team so everybody can actually move towards being a real expert. Code review. It's maybe new to some people, maybe not to others. And even though I'm going to talk about some tooling, this is really a cultural issue. We want to have a culture of code review where it's encouraged to use code review. I highly suggest Git. It's a distributed version control, but whatever version control you may use, as long as you're using it, everything you do, code, config, documentation, should be in version control. And the reason is we want to have mandatory code reviews. And if you're using Git, this is mostly going to be via pull request. Typically, there's a web page if you're using GitHub or Atlassian Stash. I think they changed it to, Bitbucket now. Somebody gets a visual diff of the changes that you made, and they get the opportunity to comment on it, say you did a great job, say that there's a problem, but the idea is to get this in front of people. And all those changes should be small. Some people may still be using a waterfall method. You push all the changes from the last quarter at the end of the quarter and hope it doesn't blow up on you. We want to move towards more of an agile method. We find one thing that we need to fix, one feature, one bug, and we push that change. They're very small. We can apply the change. If it doesn't actually fix the problem or if it's a new feature and causes a problem, we can pull just that one feature out. I highly suggest that if your tooling allows it, enable approvals. This is the idea that I push some code out. I can't merge that into production. Somebody else has to look at it and at least give it a once over and click approve. And at that point, people with right access to the repository can commit it. And again, we're the change agent, so it's up to us to talk to management. Emergencies, 3 in the morning. It's very tempting to take approvals off if you have them enabled because you just want to fix the problem. You probably got there because there wasn't enough oversight in your code review process or whatever else surrounded it. It's not the time to take away the oversight that you do have. Also use Git hooks, pre-commit hooks especially. Simple things like Puppet parser validate. Run that against all the .pp files. If it doesn't validate, why have somebody waste their time reviewing it? And we can also help people out. For me, putting some code out there and somebody saying, hey, it doesn't work, doesn't bother me, but for other people it may. Help them out with these tools so they're not, they don't feel embarrassed. We want people to participate in the culture change, not try and fight it. And of course, be positive. Code review is now public. It's not just walking up to somebody and saying, hey, I made this change. You've now got a semi-public or maybe really public if you're using just GitHub review and timeline of everything that happens. So point out when somebody does something right. When they do something wrong, try and help them out with maybe a solution or why it doesn't work as opposed to just saying this code sucks. We all have heard of the minimum viable product, which is the minimum thing we need to do to be able to sell a product to a customer and start getting some feedback. I like this concept of minimum viable customization, or MVC. When somebody comes into your organization, they may know nothing about Puppet, and we want to give them something so they can start. So this is just the minimum to do to be productive. You know, people can go ahead and customize on their own. So I put a few things up there that help me out. Shell prompt that shows the Git branch, maybe a vimrc for color coding and other functions for Puppet code and Ruby. The Git hooks, Puppet module skeleton. Whenever you generate a new module, you get the templates you need. If you have any tools for people, especially if you're using any sort of shared infrastructure services, get those installed, do some tweaks. And of course, if you have integration with Kanban, ticketing, whatever else might be out there, set that up. And the idea, again, is your coworkers come in, they've got a baseline setup. You can hand them a new laptop. It has everything on it so they can at least get started. Even if they don't know anything about Puppet, they can still write some code. Maybe provide vagrant boxes for people to do work on. If you have maybe RDP servers or something, get those set up right. And of course, use Puppet to maintain these standards. As you progress through your journey, you're going to find other things that you want to have as part of that baseline. And use Puppet to install it. That way you don't have to go out and touch umpteen machines, just like your servers. Everybody's laptop can just pull down the latest version of your MVC. But the most important thing is, I'm not working with you, you're not working with me. Find what works for your team. These are just some suggestions that have helped me and that I've heard from other people have helped them. All right, best practices and patterns for writing your Puppet code. Before we get into the actual code writing, let's talk a little bit about how Puppet works. It uses a declarative state model. You're telling Puppet what you want, not how you want it, which would be more of the imperative model, do X, do Y, do Z. So you write some code, you describe the state with some resources in your manifest. I want a user, his name is Rob Nelson, home directory, SSH key, that kind of thing. The master takes that, generates a catalog, and that has a graph of all those resources that are going to be applied on the node. And then the agent applies that catalog and tries to converge state, finds what's different, makes it the state you desired. Key point here is we want to try and avoid exec resources. Almost all of the resources that are provided by Puppet and available in modules, Puppet knows what goes in and what comes out. An exec resource makes a call out to something external to Puppet. It can't tell what happens. It can be a little unpredictable, breaks no-op mode. If you run in no-op mode, you'll see a whole ton of errors. They're not really errors, it just Puppet has no idea what's going on. So encourage people to try and avoid exec resources. This declarative state is not shell scripts 2.0. It's kind of like buying a car, ripping out the floor, and yelling yabba dabba doo, running down the street. So, all right, so now that we know how it works, we want to look at component modules. You've probably played with a lot of these, shareable modules, or at least they're designed to be shareable for a specific component. And I encourage that shareable, even if you're writing internal modules, write them like they're going to go on the forge. If you do it that way, everything will work, even if you never share it. Great pattern to follow. So if you look at a node that runs your internal web app, you've got Apache, Tomcat, the app itself, the agent. Those are all different component modules. So we're being very specific here. And of course, check the forge. I think Luke said yesterday there was like 3,588 modules. There's probably one out there for whatever it is you want to do. Find it, make it work. If it doesn't work, maybe submit some patches or talk to the author and see what you can do to get what you need put in the code. And there's plenty of documentation written by Puppet Labs and tons of other people, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but we will look at a component module shortly. Another pattern I like is the params pattern, or the params config install service pattern. And this is the pattern of don't repeat yourself. We're going to take all the parameters that that our component module needs in different subclasses and put it all in one particular subclass and then pull that in. And then we write the config install service modules, which isn't a one-size-fits-all. Sometimes whatever component it is doesn't have a service, so just leave that off. Great article, Writing Better Puppet Modules, that goes into this in great detail. And a reference module we're going to take a look at, Puppet Labs NTP. We also heard about how NTP is very important from, I think, Walmart today. Great place to start. But this is a very abridged version of NTP, so please take a look at this in more detail. Here's the main class for NTP. We declare the class. We have a list of parameters that come from NTP params and then the parameter name, which we have no idea how that works. But on the next line, after the parameters, inherits NTP params. That class, NTP params, is parsed by Puppet, and then all the variables from that scope are brought into the current scope. So that's how we make those module parameters work. And then the class itself is pretty simple. A begin and end anchor, and in between the install, config, and service submodules, or subclasses. And here's what the params looks like. We can see a few things here. We've got a default config. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so we've got the default config here, and a default service name here. Down here at the bottom, though, in this OS family Debian, it's NTP instead of NTPD. So we put all the conditionals, all the things that matter, vary by different OS families or whatever, in this module. And then our other subclasses, config and install, they inherit from NTP. So that file uses the NTP config, which comes from NTP params config, so on and so forth. And the service subclass. And something to point out here. It says, if NTP service managed equals true. This is an opinionated component module, and this is how you want to write your modules. The author may want to manage the service. Certain users may not. They may have some reason why they can't manage it. So this is a way where you can provide through that params class some defaults, but let the user overwrite it. Highly encourage that. Now that we've got the component modules down, we've written them with good patterns, we need to take a look at roles and profiles. And this is your implementation details. You're going to reference a lot of component modules here, but this is you. And the goal is one node, one role, nothing else. If you think that some node needs one role plus something else, you need a new role. And that role is your business logic. So for that web app, you've got profile base, Apache, Tomcat, web app, whatever else. And all you do is you include other profile classes, maybe, very rarely, some resource ordering if two of those profile classes may need to go in certain orders. And then the profile is the technology stack or that component, very similarly aligned to a component module. MySQL, PuppetDB, base. And a lot of times you're just going to include whatever the component module is for that technology, but you can add anything you want in here, really. For instance, with MySQL, maybe you have a data partition that comes from NFS. So you do your mount point management in there. Here's what a role looks like. Again, only profiles. I talked about the minimum viable customization before. This is a build server that has some shared tools for people to sit down on if they don't have a desktop that has all the tools installed. So we have a base profile. The build profile installs that software. And then Vim and Bash RC profiles. And then the profile class, again, can have anything. This is a fairly simple one. We include another profile for Linux, some SSH and NTP settings. And you'll notice we use include. We don't use class and the instantiation that way. And I'll show you why we do that later. And then do a hero lookup for SSH authorized keys. If they exist, we import them, and then our class is done. So it can be this simple. It can be really complex. If your profile classes start approaching, say, 100 lines, it's kind of an arbitrary number. But at that point, you might think about writing a component module and including that in your profile. OK, testing. Test-driven development, behavior-driven development. If you're not familiar with this, definitely encourage this. And the idea is we catch errors as early as possible because that's when the cost to fix them is lowest, particularly before they hit production. Nobody likes getting called at 3 a.m. We have two types of tests. Unit test, where we test a line or two of code, maybe a block of code, and we make sure that it behaves the way that we think it does. Acceptance test, maybe spin up a whole VM, apply the whole catalog, and make sure that everything actually works according to the catalog. Make sure network connectivity and everything is there. And with behavior-driven development especially, we write their test before we write the code. So we write our test, everything fails, and then we start writing code to match the test. Unit tests are definitely a requirement for refactoring. When you refactor code, you want to make sure that even though you've changed the guts of it, the output behavior hasn't changed. So if you don't have unit tests, how do you know that happens? So if you don't have unit tests, really the only refactoring you should be doing is to add some unit tests. And of course, this encourages some planning while you're writing your classes. You can actually turn the invisible spec sheet that you didn't get from the user into a list of requirements in the RSpec test. And if you're missing tests, I saw a great thing at the community summit, Puppet Retrospect. You give Puppet Retrospect your class, and it'll go out and it'll write RSpec Puppet tests for every resource that's in every class of your module. You probably want to check that. It's a very new tool, but it's a great way to get started if you don't have tests. And of course, we're going to need to improve our tests over time. We've seen a lot of things at the keynote yesterday and today that are changing how things work in Puppet. So these things they're not static. Make sure you come back and revisit them to make sure that they're working. Here's what a test looks like. It's very simple. We describe the class name. So this is profile MySQL client. We give it a few facts. Some classes may have different names, as we saw with NTP on different OSs. Then we create a context. You can have as many contexts as you want. This is just for defaults. And then inside it, you have a test. And the test is supposed to read like English. It's expected to create a class and is expected to contain a class. So we just have 2 tests. So we write that, and then we run RSpec against it. This is an RSpec Puppet test. And everything fails. 0 success, 2 fails. It's what we expect, though. So then we go write our code. We create the class, and we put the end bracket in, and if we run RSpec at that time, we'll have 1 success, 1 failure. And then we have the line in the middle, 2 successes, 0 failures. We're done writing code. So if you write those RSpec tests properly, as I said, that's your specification for what you're writing. Once all the tests pass, there's no need to write any code. And of course, as I said earlier, we're going to be showing some other people in our organization, maybe outside the organization in the company, how to do everything that we learn about. So encourage, when you do the training, ask people to ask themselves, what am I testing and is it valuable? Make sure that those tests actually help you. Biggest guideline there is test your code. Every module you have, Puppet itself, should have its own test. You can download Puppet and run those tests yourself. You should be able to do the same thing for your component modules. If you are getting a component module from the Forge and it's Puppet approved, it has to have tests. If it's not Puppet approved and you take a look and there's no test, maybe you should evaluate whether you want that running in production. And of course, you can always contribute some tests back, help out people on the Forge. But the important thing is testing. All right, so before we move on from culture, a few high points. You're the change agent. Make sure you pace the culture change and avoid that culture shock. We only get 1 shot. We're creating a culture of code review and testing. That's our primary focus at this point. And we're also going to use best practices and patterns, but we're going to be smart about it. Understand why you're using a best practice and pattern, some of the ones I showed, some others that you find, and use them for the appropriate reasons. Okay, next is tooling. There's a lot I'm going to cover with tooling. Keep in mind, these things may not apply to you, but find the things that do provide value to you and your organization and focus on those. Continuous integration. Every time we make a change, we want to make sure that that change, not just that the unit tests pass, but that it actually integrates with our code properly. Set up CI. Travis CI is a cloud-based CI solution, Jenkins CI, Bamboo, and a ton of others you can run on-prem. Somebody submits a PR, CI runs, and it gives either basically a red light, green light output. And if it's red, you don't merge. You go back to the drawing board and figure out why it's not working. If it's green, take the opportunity, then you can start your code review. And it says it in the title, continuous integration. Make sure that your systems are set up to call the CI system every time. If you leave it to a manual event, people won't do it, or even if they try and do it, it inevitably will get skipped. So make sure that's set up automatically. Next is continuous deployment. We heard about the code manager today. This is R10K. There's another tool called Librarian Puppet that you may also use. And my goal for this, at least, is never log into my master again. When I push code changes, I don't have to touch the master. R10K does it for me. Might have to get in for debugging, but that's about it. Use what's called a control repo. This is a single repository that has a Puppetfile. And it can optionally include some of the site-specific modules, like your role and profile modules. And you can even put your hero data in the control repo. Every time you create a branch, commit that code, and push it upstream, R10K in the background goes out and deploys it to your master. So a couple minutes, depending on the size of your repositories, a couple minutes later, you have a new environment available on your Puppet master, Puppet agent -t -- environment, new feature, and your nodes can test it. And if you don't have that consolidated control repo, or you just have a lot of stuff that lives outside of it, take a look at a tool called Reactor, written by Phil Zimmerman of Time Warner Cable. It's great. It helps with the workflow when you have multiple repositories. And here's what a Puppetfile looks like. And I highly suggest pinning versions for stability. You have a list of modules from the Forge followed by the version number. If you don't put the version number in, it'll check out the latest when it builds the environment for the first time, which means that new feature may get a different version than you have in production, and you start to see some errors that aren't related to the code you write. And then down at the bottom, we've got mod lab config. This comes from GitHub. You can use, I think, Git, SSH, and SVN although I don't know why you'd want to use SVN. One downside to R10K right now is it does not do dependency tracking. So you'd have to go out to the Forge and look at each of these and click on dependency and find the link and get the version for those, which you can certainly do if you'd like. But I also created a small program called Generate Puppetfile. It's available on GitHub, and you can just give it a list of modules, and it'll build a Puppetfile that includes all the dependencies for you. Okay, this is a kind of cultural tooling thing, but we're going to focus on the tool right now, is separating your code and data. If your code and data are intermingled, you can't really share your code because you're going to give out specifics about your installation. And this could be how things work, but it could also be passwords, say, to your SQL databases. Probably not something you want to give out. So we use Hira to separate the code and data to make sure we're not doing that. It's a key value lookup tool, and it has hierarchies. You can set up whatever kind of hierarchy you want. A common one might be a global hierarchy or common hierarchy, then maybe your data center, and then individual nodes. Every time you include, notice we didn't do the class instantiation, we did the include of a module, each parameter for that class will be looked up in Hira. So for NTP, we had that package manage parameter. We would look for NTP : package manage in your Hira backend, and if it finds a value at any of those tiers, it's going to use that instead of the default. So that's how we override defaults that we saw earlier. Now, there are some limits with this. Deep merge, which is where you get all the results versus the first result. HI 118, go take a look at that. Felix and I worked on some potential fixes for that, so hopefully that won't be a problem for very much longer. But that would only be fixed in 4. If you're on 3, you're going to have to deal with that. And a good example of how you would use this is NTP. You have 2 data centers. Maybe you use different NTP servers, and you could put that value, common one, and then at the data center level, you could put different values, and nodes in different data centers would get different values. Bare metal provisioning, for people who have to do bare metal provisioning, razors out there. There's a lot of other PXE-related systems for this listed at the bottom, but of course, this is the Puppet Labs approved way. It's fully supported in Puppet Enterprise 3.8, but it is available with open source. You just have to do some assembly on your own. And the idea is you literally pull something out of the box, maybe take a serial number or the MAC address off the device. That goes to the Puppet admin who puts it in the system. The person racking and stacking it just plugs it in, powers it on, and a few minutes later, it's got whatever OS or hypervisor it needs, and it's managed by Puppet. So if you're doing 100 physical nodes, that's pretty nice. Reporting, PuppetDB, we heard a lot about that this morning as well. Collects reports, exported resources, and a few other things. All the agents send that data upstream. You can also do this with masterless if you don't have a master. It's a little more complicated. You'll find some guides out there. And then PE console, Puppet board, some other dashboards let you kind of get the high-level view, how many nodes are reporting, how many aren't, and then drill down even further, find out facts about a node or status of a specific event on a run. There's also the API available, so you can craft your own queries. Plenty of things that you can do with PuppetDB for reporting. Now, the exported resources is basically where you assign a resource to a node, and then the node advertises back out, I have this resource. And that comes into play with things like monitoring. This isn't the only use of exported resources, but things like Nagios and these other monitoring systems. One of the fun problems we have to deal with is I added a node to the network, and it broke at 3 a.m., and we didn't know because we forgot to add it to monitoring. So the idea here is all those exported resources, the monitoring system can collect them and build its own config off that. So you don't have to go into Nagios and add it. It just happens. There's kind of 2 patterns you can do here. If you are only managing things from Puppet, you just have it pull in and overwrite the config. If you have some things that aren't managed by Puppet in the monitoring system, like switches and routers that don't run Puppet agent, you may need to either have 2 pollers, one for Puppet, one for not, or we use Zabbix, and the monitoring, the module there just pulls in devices and it adds them to get the config instead of overwriting it, so we don't lose the non-Puppet stuff every 30 minutes. Then you still have to go out there and maybe define some templates, but quite a few things you can do with monitoring, and certainly some other things we'll talk about in a minute for exported resources. Okay, packaging. I'm sure that everybody here just loves packaging. It's so much fun. But with Puppet, we can really maintain and distribute software like a boss. It's pretty easy. First thing is we're going to distribute apps as packages because packages are first-class citizens. Tarballs, VCS repos are not really. And we absolutely don't want to use execs. We talked about some reasons we don't want to do that before. And one of the reasons is it can be different every time, and we don't have to worry about files that are left over, particularly things like a .git or .svn directory that might compromise some security. There's tons of metadata that's used in packaging systems. Of course, it works with the OS. If you're using Red Hat, RPM-QA, and you can see all the software that's installed. We also get versioning, pre and post install scripts, plenty of things. So we want to try and use system packages first. That's my preference. You don't have to. And then application packages like Ruby gems, NPM, pip, second. As long as we're using packages, that's the important part. And then we can also distribute the packages and manage those distributions with Puppet as well. There's a Yum repo type built in. I'm sure that there are modules out there if you're using apt or Solaris or whatever system you're using. Now, that only tackles half of it. The other part is actually creating the packages, which is what's scary for everybody. Except it shouldn't be. There's a really awesome tool out there, FPM. It's available as a Ruby gem. And really, packaging couldn't be simpler. Jordan Sissel created this. And huge thanks, huge shout out to Jordan for this tool. You simply specify your input and output formats. Input can be any sort of package, list of files on the system, whatever. Give it the output format, and it goes ahead and makes it. You throw in a few other pieces of metadata, the author, your version number, that kind of stuff. And you can see here is a command, fpm-s rpm, so that's our sources in RPM, -t deb, that's our output format, -d Java, we have a dependency on the Java application, or Java package, and then example RPM. So in this case, we're converting an RPM to a deb format. You can, as I said, you can go from stuff on the file system, so maybe have your make file call this automatically. And of course, FPM itself, it's a Ruby gem, so just gem install FPM, and then you could use FPM to turn it into an RPM or deb and distribute it that way if it's easier. It also has a Puppet target type for output. I haven't used this yet, but it's supposed to create a module, so that's something that seems pretty awesome. So tie these things into your build process, so when you generate a new version of your software, it just builds a package, throws it up on the repo, and it's available for your Puppet agents to use. External integrations, I can't necessarily tell everybody what kind of external integrations they're going to use, but I can give you some ideas. And the goal here is we want to make Puppet a part of everything, not because we're selfish and we don't want people to rip Puppet out of our hands, but because this should provide value. And that's the way to really Puppetize the organization, make sure that Puppet's used everywhere, even when people don't know it. So your provisioning systems, Foreman has a great tie-in with Puppet. vRealize suite, if you use that, maybe make it part of workflows to commission and decommission nodes. Backups, maybe treat that like you do monitoring. Pull into devices so you don't have something that's really important that doesn't get backed up. And we collect a lot of facts with PuppetDB. Your config management database, IP address management, whatever other kind of databases you use, populate it. Maybe when a device fails and you get a ticket popped open, you pull in some facts or the latest Puppet run data into the ticket so people can see what happened. Basically anything that makes your company go. Find a way to make Puppet part of it and provide value to the organization. And finally, iteration. It's better to deploy now something that's not perfect than to hold on to it till it is perfect, because perfect never actually happens. And your idea of perfect may not meet what actually is ideal for your organization. So the idea here is we choose something. For me, this was R10K. I didn't like logging into the master and having to download the latest code and push it out and create the environment every time. So find that and make it work. You're going to come back and visit it later, and that's cool. Find the next thing. Now that you've got that under control, there's probably something else that's bothering you most every day. Make that work. Get it out there. Solicit feedback. Find ways to make it better once it's out there. And just go through all the different, talked about a lot of tools, the ones that matter to you. Make sure you go through them all until you have something for everything. And then come back and repeat it every, depending on the size of your team and organization, every 6, 12, 18 months. Go through and find ways to revisit these systems and see if, even if all you do is look at it and say, nope, it works great for us, nothing's changed, we're awesome, make sure you do that. And then you can see the okay, good, better, new tech. That would be Puppet 4 coming out, the application orchestrator. You're going to kind of get sent back to square one sometimes. That's okay. Just keep iterating through it and get it out there. So a recap of what we talked about today. We are the change agent, and we're going to be trying to create a culture of change and feedback. There's a ton of tools available in the ecosystem, and we're going to find the ones that matter to us and start implementing them. And as we do both of these, we're going to iterate to success on the culture and tooling side. Get something out there and improve it. Don't let it languish while you're waiting for it to be perfect. So hopefully I've put enough together today that everybody feels like they can go back and Monday morning start puppetizing their organizations. So I do have a bunch of reference links. These will be available on SlideShare shortly. A lot of things I talked about are on there, and certainly Google for the rest. And a quick shout out, some thank yous. My wife, she's pretty awesome for all the support. Come out here and talk to you all. Puppet Labs and the Puppet community. Learned so much from the Puppet community. I highly recommend that you participate in some way, shape, or form. And some reviewers, Jason, Ryan, Richard, Waleed, and Tim. So, thank you very much. We've got 7 minutes and change for any questions.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question about, did you have to do any organizational changes to allow for the puppetization and who manages it and who keeps track of it, et cetera?
So organizational changes, no. Like I said, change agent, talk to your manager. Didn't have to change the organization, but did have to spread the word and make sure we get buy-in. Change is hard. So no matter what you do, you're going to get a little pushback. You just got to kind of feel that out and make sure you're not moving too fast. And if you do run into problems, figure out a way around them. Sometimes what you think is a good idea may actually not be.
I'm thinking if I have 15 puppet masters, I have a continuous integration pipeline, et cetera, going on. I personally, as a one person, I won't be able to keep track of all of that. So did you guys end up making a puppet team or someone who was in charge of keeping the puppet side up and running?
Yeah, I suggest that you have like one person who's like the driving architect, but it really depends on the size of your team. If it's 2 or 3 people, it's probably just going to be one person. But maybe make a small committee so you can avoid bike shedding. But have a consensus of what the architecture looks like. Document that. Make sure that documentation's in some sort of version control so people can understand it if you get hit by a bus or decide to leave or whatever. It's good to have that design and make sure everybody does understand it.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Oh, sorry.
Quick question, thanks again. Sure. I also work for a large corporation and we're just starting with a Puppet. One of the things I see as a possible problem is our change management infrastructure that we have. And did you have any problems, any tips on how to deal with groups that are used to stopping change as opposed to facilitating change?
Yeah, so...
I work for another company that's not in front of me, so...
Yeah, I probably can't get into specifics, but so a couple things I did was one, I use Puppet at home. So I got into the habit of when I make a change to, say, my little lab DNS and stuff, I have that process. And I tried to get other people to follow that. And what we did was we found the quick wins. Your Oracle database is probably the last thing you want to touch, but find the a wiki server, a file server, something that isn't used 24/7, and if you lose it for an hour, isn't a big deal. And what we did was just kind of push for, okay, normally we have to do this at 10 p.m. at night. Let's do this during the day when we actually have support if something goes wrong. I mean, 10 p.m. at night, less interruption, but If it blows up, you're tired, the weekend's coming up, you want to get out of there, it doesn't go well. So we just tried to move that earlier, and once we had a few successes with that, where we made a change at, say, 4 p.m., and it was back up by 5, then it's a lot easier to say, all right, we're just going to come in Monday morning at 8 a.m. and start doing stuff.
So this is a cultural question, and I don't expect answers, but I don't know, or not from you specifically, but maybe from anyone. How do you make that change? How do you make your fellow sysadmins and sysadmin managers unafraid of the good, and how do you make them unafraid to let go of the perfect and just take a step?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if anybody else has comments on that one. For me, it was just leading by example, really. We still get some of the, oh, we're going to wait till it's perfect before we show anybody. But by getting things out there and getting feedback and showing that we can improve it, it helps. Obviously, if you can try and drive from more of, I think it usually aligns more with the waterfall versus agile, let's do everything at once versus let's get something and build on it. If you have that kind of change in your company, even if it's not in your organization, kind of ride on its coattails. That's helpful. I don't know if anybody else has suggestions on that one.
Hi there.
Hi.
I just have a question regarding use of custom execs. You said to pretty much always avoid that, but is there a use case where, is it absolute last resort, or
Yep.
is there kind of a rule of thumb that you can go by there? Because, we manage some custom applications, and in some cases you can't build a package for it,
Yep.
and you really have to do a test and then an
Yep.
exec, or like you're trying to install an application that can only be done through an install script. So is that a pretty good example, or is there?
Yeah, so really it should be the resource type of last resort. Use those first-class citizens before you resort to execs. But there are going to be times, a common example I've heard is, I think it was IBM WebSphere or some IBM Java stuff. You got to install it, start it up once, and then stop it, and then change the config, and then start it up again. I mean, there's no way you can package that, right? You are going to have to sometimes go with execs or some long, complicated process. My suggestion, if you do that, if you think you need more than one exec, or you need something like copy a file plus an exec plus copy some other file, it might be time to look at creating a script that does all those steps so you want to run one exec. But you have to look at how it's going to affect the state model. If that file has to come before something else, you can't do ordering inside the exec. It can get complicated, but certainly make it the last resort. If you do have to, minimize it. I think we got time for one more. Or was there, I saw a couple hands up. Was there comments on the previous one?
This was really just to give an answer to the previous gentleman's question. One of the things that I did successfully to get Puppet implemented was to go for some what we call low-hanging fruit. In other words, some challenges that the company had. Nobody's got a perfect environment, and we had some issues where the bugs were cropping up, and it was because they were due to changes in different systems. So using Puppet, I said, okay, if we install it all this way, we'll get rid of those kind of problems, and we did. Another one is we weren't putting out security patches on time. We had nearly 50 servers, and there was a lag. It would take 2-3 days, and look, we can do this in an hour or two. In other words, you pick a few targets like that, and then once you've got a few proven successes, then you get much more leeway to do other things.
Shell shock was great for that one. A lot of people probably said package bash ensure and then the version that was patched. Put that in your base profile that gets applied to all nodes, and shell shock isn't an issue anymore. That's a great example. So was there one more hand up over there?
This is just another comment on the acceptance of frequent change in an organization. Having been in organizations that either followed ITIL standards with change management, which would be a 4-hour-long change management meeting every week, or organizations that are using Agile, like the thing that really helps with that is making sure that there is a consistent documentation of some kind. This is why it is almost imperative to have source control on your Puppet code. It allows for the transparency of being able to say, okay, there's the issue right there, go back, done. It's once you can have that kind of measure of transparency, it makes it very easy for the rest of an organization with success stories to be able to have that buy-in to say, okay, we can trust this, we can see where the issues lie, and very easily roll back if we need to. Usually, hopefully, knock on wood, that it's within business hours.
Yeah, and kind of right on that one, I think there was a talk yesterday about how to set up your Puppet code so that the git commit hash shows up in your catalog so you know which change broke things. All right. Well, thank you all for showing up and the great questions and answers. Thank you.
Typical data center wasn't a